Okay. Okay. I got this story from Joe and I had to share it because I think it's delightful and I love the way God works and I love stories about the way God works. Joe and his family moved here in August of 2016, and their reason for coming was to help some friends that were planting a church. And at the time, Joe was speaking and consulting nationally. Well, this is his story. The first month I was here, I was meeting people working on poverty issues. So I met with Ryan Ulrich, who was running the Homeless Coalition at the time. He put me on their email list, and the very first email that came out was from Steve Allen, who was the director of Family Promise at the time, saying that Family Promise wanted to create an emergency shelter for families, and he needed someone to help design and direct it. So as Joe says, I sent an email saying I'd be happy to consult on the project. Steve and I went to lunch together that day, and Steve invited me to the Family Promise fundraiser at the Civic Theater that night. I went. Steve grabbed me and pulled me up on stage, handing me the mic and said, "Tell everyone what the emergency shelter Open Doors is going to be like." So I did. Mind you, I was not on the staff, had not agreed to work for Family Promise yet, but God had other plans. I was officially hired the next Monday, and time has flown by since. So that was in August of 2016. In 2019, Joe became the executive director. And how Family Promise has grown. The year he arrived, Family Promise served 67 people. That was the 3 families rotating week by week to different churches. Last year, Family Promise served 2,951 people in their various programs. So on that note, Joe, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you, Covenant Families. We've really been partnered with you guys for a long, long time. And I could say you're one of our best congregational supporters, without a doubt. So thank you for that. I'm gonna just walk through a quick presentation. And you guys know Family Promise from the rotational shelter program, but I wanna share a little bit more about where we are, where we're going, and then also how now, as we've been changing for the past couple of years, how congregations can re-engage in what part you guys would have with it. So let me just start out with, I'm going to share my screen here. And we'll walk through this presentation together. I'll make it lively, I promise. And if you have any questions, just jump in throughout the presentation. So the first question I have for you is, when most people are thinking of homelessness, what do you think they're thinking of? What comes to mind? What's the visual image of homeless when people are thinking of homelessness?
Person on the street.
Person on the street, yeah. What do they look like?
Dirty, disheveled.
Yep, dirty, disheveled. What else?
Drug
Hungry.
induced.
Addicted to drugs. Okay, yep, we see that.
Mental health issues.
Mental health issues, yeah. Are they male? Are they female? What do they look like?
Male, panhandlers.
Yeah. Yeah, when most people picture homelessness, they have a picture in their mind that kind of looks like this, right? It's the single man on the street, sleeping under, Brown Street Bridge downtown, or holding a sign at the freeway entrance or exit. That's what people have in their minds as homeless. That's the picture of homeless. What most people are not thinking of is this. These are the kids and families that we serve. So all of the kids in this picture have been in one of our shelters in the past 2 years. So every single one of these is real families here with us at Family Promise. So Kids represent the fastest growing population of homeless in our country. They are approaching close to 40% of the homeless in our country is children under the age of 18. And it's a large need here in Spokane County. In fact, 1 in every 25 students, this is in 2019, so before COVID, 1 in every 25 students, kindergarten through 12th grade, experience homelessness at some point during the 2018-2019 school year. So that's basically 1 kid per classroom almost for every single school that you drive past in Spokane County. So that was 3,108 kids. When we add their little brothers and sisters that aren't school age yet and their parents into that mix, we're probably talking about 12,000 people a year in a family unit that are experiencing homelessness in Spokane County every year. So at any given point in time, that's about 1,000 students, kindergarten through 12th grade, that are couch surfing, that are staying in cars, that are sleeping in motels at some point. And a lot of people are just shocked when they hear these numbers, because they're big numbers. And what we see on the street when we're driving is not that. And the reason for that is because it's not safe to have your kids downtown. It's not safe to have them standing on a street corner holding a sign. And because of that, families are out of sight and they're out of mind when it comes to the homelessness discussion. Even though here in Spokane County, families are 35% of the homeless population, so some type of family unit. The impacts of homelessness on children is pretty severe. Our kids are 3 times more likely to drop out of school. They are 5 times more likely to be convicted of a violent crime. And they are 7 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population. So what we want to do here at Family Promise is reduce, either prevent or reduce the length and severity of a homeless experience on children. So our mission actually is to equip families and communities to end the cycle of homelessness. We want to equip families and the community to end the cycle of homelessness. Notice how it doesn't say run shelters, right? Actually, the day that we can shut the shelters down because there's no more need, we've accomplished our mission, and that'll be a fantastic day. We're not at that day yet, but we've made some pretty significant progress, and we're going to make a whole lot more. So let me just walk through a little bit how we go about this. So we look at this in 3 different ways. The first way is that purple dot there, that prevent. We want to prevent as many families from becoming homeless as we can. We do that through rental assistance and through diversion. Diversion is just a fancy term for having a conversation to help people avoid homelessness, diverting them from a shelter. So is there any other family you can stay with? Is there another resource you can lean on to help pay your rent, or things like that? So that's been the fastest growing program that we have had. We did receive a significant amount of funding from the American Rescue Plan for prevention in the past year. And so that's why we've been able to help so many people with children in Spokane city limits from being prevented from being homeless. And I'll pull that up in a little bit, Gail. I found that slide that Emma showed you the other day. I'll pull it up towards the end here. But actually, and I can probably pull that up now. Let me try that. 1 second here. There it is. So last year, Gail was right, 918 children, 664 parents prevented from becoming homeless through rental assistance in 2021. And that's at our Housing Assistance Center, which is a brand new location that we opened in October that processes those applications. I'll show you a little bit more of that. So that's been a significant portion of how we've been going about trying to end homelessness. here in Spokane County. Before COVID, the average cost to keep a family housed was $340. That's how much they were missing on their rent. $340 to prevent an eviction. During COVID, that has astronomically increased and had gotten up to a point to where we were almost spending $6,000 to keep evictions from happening and paying back rent. That's coming down now, but particularly for single parents, when school was not in session or they were doing school online, our single parents had to figure out, what do I do? Do I go to work or do I stay home with my kids? And so they were very far back on rent. And so that's been one of the big concerns with the eviction moratorium running out is, how many families are going to be impacted and how do we prevent more people from entering the shelters? So, and then provision. Our provision is once a family becomes homeless, providing shelter, a safe place that's focused on them exiting to permanent housing. How do we provide the right location for that? And I'll show you some of our statistics there in a little bit. We have several different shelters now, and I'll walk through those. But basically, any family, anybody that's caring for a minor child or who is pregnant in Spokane County, that's what we consider a family. That could be grandparents caring for grandkids. That can be aunts and uncles caring for nieces and nephews. They can walk into our emergency shelter the day they become homeless and receive services. That's the intent of the emergency shelter, is to have a place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, where if a family becomes homeless, they can walk in there and start to get help. And that program has been very successful and is continuing to grow and expand. And I'll show you some of those things in a minute. But then, and I'll get into our shelters because we've done some pretty significant expansion there. The last area here, preparing families for a stable future. This is by far the weakest area of our community as far as addressing homelessness, and probably the most substantial way that the faith community can impact moving forward. And here's what I mean by that is I get asked all the time, what's the cause of homelessness, right? What's causing all this homelessness? What's the cause of it? And there's a lot of different factors and reasons, and I've got a whole other presentation that gets into that. It's hard to say the cause, but I can say that there's one common denominator. There's only one across all homeless, whether you're talking about single individuals or veterans or seniors or families or children. There's one common thing that they all have in common, and that is this. There's some type of loss of community. They've got nobody else they can lean on, whether that's sinful things that they've done, sinful things that have been done to them, or just circumstance. The reason that somebody becomes homeless is because they have nobody else they can lean on. So they end up on the streets. So we can get people into housing, but if we don't rebuild community and relationships, they're one paycheck away, one crisis away, one medical issue away from becoming homeless again. And so what we want to do, and this is going to be a big focus of ours moving forward, is wrap community around our families after they leave the shelter. So if a family lands in a neighborhood that's near one of our church partners, we want that church partner to know, and we want them to connect with that family, invite them into their church community and participate with that. And so I'll give you two examples of families where one had that happen and one didn't, and the difference in the two. So 3 years ago, right at the beginning of summer, we had a mom, dad, 3 boys, baby on the way, come into the emergency shelter. The dad sat in the car for actually an hour and a half before he walked in the building. Later on, we found out he was considering leaving his family altogether at that point. Like that's our starting point. We start with families on their worst day. I mean, he was embarrassed. He was feeling defeated and really hopeless that, you know, he couldn't provide for his family, and they end up at an emergency shelter. Luckily, we brought that family in. They stayed with us the whole summer, and it was a tough go for them. It was tough through the shelter, through the transition. They actually say that the shelter saved their marriage, of all things. And the reason why was that we do lights out at 9:30, and they were like, well, we just had to lay there next to each other, so it forced us to talk to each other. But during that time period, one of our church partners was volunteering and met this family and just started having conversations, invited them to their church. And the father went. The mother was not interested in it at all. But the dad went to the church service because he was invited. He ends up becoming saved. I got to baptize him there. And then later on, his wife came to know the Lord, got saved there. They got into housing the day before school started. So they were with us the entire summer. They had the baby the next week. And actually they had contacted 242 places before they found somebody that would rent to them. 242. That's how hard it is to find housing right now. But they got into housing, but this church became their community. Fast forward to last November, or two Novembers ago, Dad's having trouble seeing. He's having trouble in one of his eyes. And so he goes to the optometrist. The optometrist says, you know, it's not your eye. You've got a tumor behind your eye. You've got a brain tumor, basically. And so he's got to go to Seattle for specialist appointments. And how are they going to get there? And how are they going to pay for the hotel? And who's going to watch their kids while they're going through treatment? Because they had this church community, they took care of caring for that family. Became their community to lean on. And so although they are in major crisis, their likelihood of becoming homeless again is really low because they've got this community wrapped around them. Another family, to contrast this, very similar family makeup, got into housing but didn't rebuild any community connections. 2 weeks before Christmas, 2 years ago, Dad commits suicide. And so Mom's first and only call is to our case manager at the shelter because she doesn't know anybody else and she has nobody else to lean on. And so we frantically tried to wrap resources around them and got a church to try to care for them. But because they hadn't built those relationships ahead of time, they're on very shaky ground. And we're here, you know, over a year out from that time period. And I would say it's probably a coin toss if that family ends up homeless again or not. And the main difference, even though there's major crisis points with both of these families, the main difference is that community relationship. And so when we're talking about preparing families for a stable future, that's a key component to that. And then just helping them achieve more to get to stability. Housing is not stable, is not stability, but it is one of the rungs on the ladder. It's the third rung on the ladder, but there's probably about 17 others before you get to living wage jobs and stable income and stable housing situations. So that's a big area of focus moving forward, and just wanted to share a little bit with you. Any questions so far on this? All right. This is hard to see, but it breaks it down a little bit more of what we do in each of those different areas. What I wanted to show you was this, and I'll show you it in a different diagram a little bit later, but the family emergency shelter is kind of the doorway. It's the first stopping point for families as they come in. But from there, we are opening up these smaller neighborhood sites and these specialized sites. The neighborhood sites operate out of usually a house right now. And are designed around a smaller focus for families, trying to get them into a better community environment, and also for specialized families. So special, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about families with infants or families that are exiting the hospital after a surgery, something like that. We have a special location for them. Also, this mission house location tends to be families that are special needs. So they've got a child with autism that can't work well in the big shelter, or it's a grandparent that is caring for grandkids and has some physical difficulties with, hey, I can't sleep on the mat on the floor in the emergency shelter, or things like that. And so that tends to be more special needs. The reason why we are expanding this way, which is really growing by growing smaller in a lot of areas, is because the outcomes from these smaller site locations are dramatically better than from the large emergency shelters. And our emergency shelter outperforms all of the other emergency shelters in Spokane County significantly. We are housing about 58% of the folks that come through that emergency shelter into permanent housing. But when we move them to the smaller neighborhood site locations, that increases to 95%. The average emergency shelter houses 4%. So we're dramatically better than our emergency shelters, outperforming the others by about 10 times, but the smaller sites are just drastically different. So what you guys, yeah.
Could you do a little bit more about exactly where these spots are, so that I know that Mission House is 2002 East Mission, and that's been on Hartson and everything, but most, with the exception of Barry, Barb, and I'm not sure how many people know what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me get there in a couple slides. We're about 3 slides away. Sound good? All right. One of the things, and I'll also talk in just a moment about the rotational shelter program. So the church rotations, which you guys are the most familiar with, how those are going to come back and when they're going to come back, or at least my hope for how they're going to come back. Family Promise started really as it was Interfaith Hospitality Network of Spokane. And it was a group of churches that gathered together to house families in their church buildings, up to 3 families at a time. And the reason why it was 3 families was because that's about how many you could fit into a van. And so the van was the size factor, the limiting factor on how many families could participate in that program. And then just the congregation. So 13 congregations would house a family 1 week out of each quarter. And you guys were one of those, and you have one of the best facilities for it, by the way. So the families love the gym there, and that ability to use that. And then they would rotate to a different church facility. We ran that program successfully for 22 years. And then COVID overnight paused the church rotational shelter. It was pretty significant change for us. March 13th of 2020, we went from 600 volunteers to 6 in a day. With that, it was a dramatic difference for us. It also caused us to open up our Hartson location as an additional shelter location, which then allowed us to see how these neighborhood sites could function, and how well that location did as a standalone, and actually influenced the direction that we are growing in now, and then how we're going to re-engage churches moving forward. So there was beneficial side effects of it, but it was a dramatic change, and we definitely want to bring the rotation back when we're able. This COVID thing keeps hanging around though, guys. So but I'm ready to be over it. I think everybody's ready to be over it. So we're gonna get back to some other areas here. A couple of things I wanted to point out. We are doing a really good job at housing people. So since July of 2019, we've housed 406 individuals. That's more than double the next closest shelter in Spokane County. The next closest, so the star represents emergency shelters. So walk-in, low barrier shelters. We are dramatically outperforming the other shelters on getting people out of homelessness and into housing of their own. That's a significant focus for us. This little guy is named Oliver. He was born at Family Promise in the shelter. Not in the shelter. He was born while his family was staying at the shelter last year. His family actually was COVID positive. We had an outbreak when he was born. So both of his parents were COVID positive the day he was born, which was our biggest nightmare. And it actually came true, but everybody was ended up being healthy. The baby ended up being fine. The reason why I'm showing you this picture is because Oliver represents the largest single age demographic that we serve. The largest group that we serve is 1 and under. So we have a lot of babies. We've actually had 20 newborns this past year at Family Promise, and a lot of children under the age of 1. So when most people are thinking of homelessness, they're not thinking of babies at all. And when I talk to churches, I like to talk about this. We actually worship a God that was born a homeless child. When you think about it, there was nowhere to go. There was no place in the inn. So if Jesus was born in Spokane County right now, they would end up at our shelter, most likely. So the reason, one of the big things that this caused us to do was open up a smaller site, one of those neighborhood sites, specifically for families with newborns this past year. And so we opened up the Family Infant House, which is called Infant Shelter on here. So this is our expansion plan, and I'll show you how it looks and works. But our triage site is actually the emergency family shelter. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. That's on the corner of Mission and Napa, the old Casano's Grocery and Deli building. If any of you remember Casano's, I missed the meatball subs. I'm going to be honest with you there, but we are appreciating the building. So after Casano's closed in 2018, we purchased the building in 2019, and then remodeled it. And that's actually where the emergency shelter is. Last night, we sheltered 70 people in that location. So that is where we are having the emergency shelter. And then we have these smaller site shelters that are spread out, these neighborhood sites. And if you see these little satellites here, that is the way that we intend to build the rotational shelter back in the future, is actually around the neighborhood sites. So rather than having one rotational program for all of Spokane County like we had before, we're going to find a neighborhood site, and then we are going to build the church partnerships around that location so that it's a group of churches in that community that are caring for families that are staying in that community, and hopefully that we place those families back in that same community moving forward. Trying to really refocus that on those areas. All right, so here's some of the locations that we have now. So we have the emergency family shelter. That's the old Casano's Grocery Italian building deli. We're doing a lot of construction there. So this picture was taken when there was workers and construction happening out front. That should be done by spring here, and we'll be moving forward. But this is where most families go the day they become homeless. They walk in those front doors there and receive shelter and services in a safe place. We also are purchasing the house next door. This is Mission Special Needs House. That's this one right here. It's right next door to this building. That's where families with special needs are staying right now. We can house up to 9 people there, 3 families. And like I said, it's usually a family that has a child with autism or a grandparent that's caring for grandkids, something of that nature, that has a really hard time operating the larger shelter. This over here on the right side is the family infant house. We opened that in July. This is a pilot program that we are doing. It's actually the Dominican sisters that own the house. So a group of Catholic nuns, that was where they lived for the past 70 years. Now their order's down to 2 people. And so they're allowing us to use that house for this year. And then we have a purchase option on it, but we need to close by May 1st. So we're working on raising the funds to purchase that house. We actually have 5 families with newborns staying there right now. So that's where the family infant house is. Probably, if you guys ever visited one of our locations, you probably visited this location. That's the Hartson location. Currently, that location is used as a COVID quarantine site. So for homeless families that are experiencing COVID, this is where they are housed. Today, we have 3 families there that are experiencing COVID right now. And in the future, in the next month or so, that we will rent a different house for that COVID quarantine location. And then this site will become what's called Hartson Healing House. And that's for families that are exiting the hospital after some type of medical procedure. Whereas you and I, and many of us now are, visiting the doctor more often. When the doctor says, go home and rest for 2 weeks. Well, when you have no home, there's nowhere to go to. And so for homeless families, they actually get exited from the hospital directly into the emergency shelter, which is like the worst possible location. They've got open wounds, they're trying to recover, and now they're in a mass setting with a bunch of people and germs and everything else. And so Hartson will end up being that location right there next to the hospital district. And then the newest one is this one here down in the right corner. This is actually Cheney House. So this is in Cheney. And is a pilot that we are trying outside of the city limits. So a lot of the future expansion is going to be into areas outside of the city limits of Spokane. We actually have a group of folks that come to the emergency shelter from Cheney. And so rather than them coming downtown to receive services, we want to place them back in their own community where their kids are already going to school and try to build community there. And that one's in a mobile home park. So, there's a lot of different ways that these can be done in different places. Questions, thoughts?
What about Richard Allen Court?
Richard Allen Court. So that location, we had to move out of there in 2019 because they were going to be reusing that for other purposes. So we don't currently have a location in Richard Allen Court, although we do still have strong relationships with Bethel AME and the Emmanuel Family Life Center there. We've been partnered with Bethel AME and actually some type of either our offices or our shelter had been in that historically Black community for 18 of our 25 years. So we are still connected to them very, very strongly, but we don't have a location in Richard Allen currently.
Any plans for Spokane Valley, Joe?
Yes, we've been trying to get into Spokane Valley for
Years.
Yeah, the emergency family shelter, the infant shelter originally was going to be at Spokane Valley Partners in Spokane Valley, but we couldn't get through zoning to make it happen. They've changed some things with their zoning that might allow one of these neighborhood sites moving forward, but about 17% of our population comes from Spokane Valley. So it's a pretty large group of folks that are from the valley that come to the emergency shelter. And so it's definitely high on the list to get a Spokane Valley location and then a north location at some point. So you guys might fit in well with that north location.
You have staff on duty at all of these satellite places?
Yes, yeah. The staff varies depending on the location and how many people are there. So it's a lighter staff for sure than the emergency shelter. And they don't stay overnight. So there's usually a site manager that works 40 hours a week. And then there's a mixture of staff that do pop-ins. So they'll rotate around from the different sites on a weekend, on a Saturday, they'll just stop by and check on things, make sure things are going all right. And then there's always an emergency on call. In case something happens, there's always a phone number that somebody can call and receive assistance. But for the most part, these sites are smaller and they don't see, so far we have not experienced where there's been a major need for 24-hour staffing at them, which has been helpful because for the most part, the families are ready to go to bed at night. What my hope is as we reintroduce volunteers in churches, is that remember how the families rotated to the churches before. We kind of want to reverse that model and have each church take a week where they rotate and care for one of the locations. And so they're coming in and volunteering in one or more of the locations to serve that location for 1 week out of every quarter, even before we open up the church rotational shelter model again. So what this does do is it gives a lot more volunteer opportunities. So if you guys remember before, it was like, either you can make lasagna or you could stay overnight. And you might have some folks that said, well, my skill and talent set may be different than those two volunteer options or my desires. And so this opens up a lot more opportunities. The emergency shelter allows for large groups to serve together, which we didn't have that opportunity before. And so, I mean, we could have up to 120 serving at one time in large project setting. And then the smaller sites allow for just kind of a deeper, more intimate environment. And we are changing some of our policies, particularly around the family infant house, because historically, if you remember, like you weren't allowed to hold children, babies, things like that, because of liability issues. We are going to change that around the family infant house because sometimes our single moms just need a little break. And it would be great to have somebody else hold the baby for a little bit while they took a break for a little while. And so that's some of the things that we are looking at moving forward.
Joe,
Do you have-
what are your transportation needs these days? And how do you handle it? And how's Kermit?
Kermit is great. And so our transportation needs are actually, this doesn't require much transportation. Particularly because two of these locations, the family infant house and the emergency shelter, are on the new high-speed bus line downtown. So in the future, there will be a bus every 7 minutes coming across both those locations. But because the families are staying, there hasn't been that much need for transportation. We do have transportation back and forth to the isolation facility when a family tests positive for COVID, which we are doing testing every 2 days for everybody. So we're trying to keep that in check. And the guardians currently are the ones that are transporting. So that agency comes and picks our folks up and moves them to that location.
Emma said that you need a pickup, so now's your chance to make a pitch.
We need a pickup truck. Our facilities team needs a pickup truck. So they've actually been using our facilities van was how do I say that? Not driven into. A drunk driver smashed into our facilities van last year, and we got some money from it, but wasn't enough to replace it. And so we've been looking for a new van, but we have a need for a truck because picking up washers and dryers in a van is a difficult task, or things that are a bit taller or larger. And so we need something with an open bed that they can drive around. So if you got a truck that you might want to donate to us, or know somebody that might have one, we would appreciate a facilities vehicle.
Do you have staff full 24/7 at the main building?
We do. Yep. We have 24/7 staff, and there's usually 2 staff members at least on at all times, as well as case management. So our case managers, our office there, and then they rotate to the different sites from there. And then Kerm, Ted, coming back to Kerm, he's our graveyard supervisor. So Kerm works in the middle of the night. If you guys know Kermit, he was our longtime driver, and then has been probably the most faithful graveyard shift person we've ever had, or that any organization has ever had. I think he's missed 1 day in 4 years on his graveyard shift. So he, and that was, I think we forced him to miss that day. So yeah, he's a very faithful volunteer. Love Kerm.
Joe, you mentioned the pickup truck, but what about a panel truck? Something, like delivery trucks like furniture stores use.
Yeah, a panel truck, a bread truck, like the UPS uses would be a fantastic one. We've been looking at those, and everybody's converting those into, RVs now. And so those have gone up really a lot in price, but really we're open to anything like that to look at. We do need some help there. And because we also, the facilities team has been using the passenger van. And we do have some need for the passenger van to come back to transport folks back and forth to different places, but it's not consistent like like when we had the rotation going, but we will need that in the future.
Joe, what about the updating or finishing or whatever, the basement and the second story there at 2002 Mission?
Yeah, so great segue, Gail. I should have teed you up. This is fantastic. So this building, you may not know it and may have never seen it, but it also has a 6,000 square foot basement that was originally a neighborhood strip mall in 1949. And so there are storefronts in the basement of this building. There's a beauty salon and a jewelry store and a cleaners, and there was a Studebaker parts supplier, all in the basement of that building in the 40s and early 50s. And then best we could tell is sometime in about 1955, the basement was closed and sat as storage for the better half of the next 60 years. So one of the reasons why we purchased the building was so that we could convert that basement and make it usable space. And so that construction project is underway right now. That will add another 25 bed capacity for the emergency shelter, and will provide private counseling rooms for the case managers to work with the families while the children have a play area to be in. One of the issues right now for our families is every single agency that they go to, your kids have to sit on your lap while they ask you really personal questions about your abuse history, about your sexual history, about your drug use. And so what ends up happening is our parents either lie because they don't want to talk about that in front of their kids, and so then they don't get the resources that they need and are qualified for, or they tell the truth and they come back embarrassed and ashamed in front of their kids. And so we're creating these specialized counseling rooms that have a play area in them. So there's a play area in the front, and then there's a window and a door where the case managers meet with the parents, but the parents can still see the kids in a safe environment that will be in the basement of this facility, that any case manager from any agency in the county that works with one of our families can come and meet with our families on site there and have that environment. So we are in the midst of that construction project. That's been a lot of work to get that going. We are still raising about $199,000 to complete it. It's scheduled to be completed at the end of March. So it is on track for that. We had to dig a giant hole to put a new stairwell in for exiting from that place. We've already done all that, so that's been done. And now they are in the depths of construction, but it's going to be a really neat space and a really good project. Yeah.
Joe, since you've got this picture on the screen of the various facilities, what's the capacity for each facility, either the number of families or the number of individuals?
Great question. Yeah, currently the emergency shelter, which is this one, and Mission House, which is this one, together combined 70 people. Actually 69 there. And then Family Infant House, it's 5 families currently. After we purchase it, we're going to dig an egress window, and that'll become up to 7 families. And so our families average between 3.1 and 3.5 people. So that house is currently 15 to 20, will go to 21 to 25 people out of that location. Hartson is 5 families, so 15 to 20 there. This site is 3 families, 9 people. The 3-bedroom there.
And then what will be the new capacity when the basement gets finished?
So the new capacity, it'll add another 25 beds of capacity at the emergency shelter. So really, we have this new site, and this site is what's been saving us this winter from having to turn away. We got some additional funding for the winter time, but that funding runs out in July. And so the basement will become the permanent source or resource for that in the future. And so altogether, well, in the past year, we went from serving 60 people a day. I think we're at close to 109 capacity now. So almost doubled our capacity in the past year, most of that privately funded. And so the Family Infant House is operations are completely privately funded, and we have almost 18 months of that already in the bank for that location. We just need to raise the money for the capital to purchase it to make it permanent. So
Then what about the apartments upstairs?
So the apartments upstairs, so there's 8 apartments here on the 2nd level. 3 of those are rented to tenants that were already in the building when we purchased the building that remained. There are 2 that are not in use. One is being used as showers for our families, another shower facility until the basement is done. And then one is used for currently isolating a family or families when they test positive before they could be moved over to the other location. So that apartment has been sitting that way. And then the other, so that's, sorry, 3, 5. So the other 3 apartments are actually rented to former guests. So our families, as they exit the shelter, some of our families are renting some of those spaces.
And then for those that don't know, the idea is that as the tenants upstairs move out, that then you take over those apartments, right?
Correct. That's our intent, is so that they become more housing units. Yes, so they become more housing units moving forward. And yes, we are looking for sites up north by you guys. We've met with the New Hope Center as a possible partnering together between Family Promise and New Hope and heading up to do one of these neighborhood sites up north. You may not know it, but poverty in particular and homelessness has been increasing in the suburbs. And this is a trend that started happening in the year 2000. So before 2000, poverty was moving from rural to urban. And then in the year 2000, a switch started happening and we started seeing poverty move from urban to suburban. And so the downtown cores became revitalized and got more expensive, which started pushing families outwards that were in poverty. And what used to be single family residential downtown homes got demolished and started becoming condominiums and higher density, more expensive. And so that pushed the more poverty families out further. You see this all across the country. Spokane's about 10 years behind where other major cities are in this. So what you're seeing is poverty and homelessness in places that they didn't see it before. So, the Spokane Valley, not only having to recognize they have a homeless problem, but like there's people sleeping across the street from City Hall in the park, which they hadn't experienced before the past decade before. And so we're continuing to see that push out happening across the country, and it's going to remain happening. But what that means is our school districts, our outlying school districts outside of the city limits, are having the highest percentage of homeless children growth year over year compared to downtown. And so you're seeing Cheney in Area Heights and Meade in the Valley increasing in their homeless student populations because of that continued movement out. So.
Joe?
Yes.
Hi, Sarah. Speaking of schools, with these different locations, do you try to connect the kids to schools at that point?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we get our kids into school right away. School is their one safe, stable place.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the most part, our kids stay at the school that they were from.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a law that requires the school to keep them at their home school and then bus them back and forth. And so we have a bunch of buses that pick up at the emergency shelter and take kids all over the place every day. But about half the families that show up at the shelter haven't informed their schools that their kids are homeless. And so we work with the counselors and let them know, hey, these kids should be qualifying for this extra support that they get from that. But absolutely, school is the one essential for these kids as far as stability goes.
Joe, how often do you see repeat families come into the program? Do you have an idea? Oh.
Yeah, we're actually we've been working on reducing that. So for all of homelessness, they're most likely to become homeless again within 2 years of when they leave a shelter. And so we've been reducing that. That's down to 6% recurring rate, so a 94% retention rate for our families after we get them into housing. And so only 6% are returning to homelessness currently. And I'd love to see that at 0. But we're getting better and better at that. When I started, that was closer to 15-20% a couple of years ago. So we've added the case manager for aftercare, Susan. Many of you know Susan. And so that's been helpful to help stabilize folks after we get them into housing, because there's at least somebody they can call in an emergency. But as we wrap more community around them, that rate of housing retention will continue to increase. All right, I'm gonna jump to 2 more slides because I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but this is how we look at fundraising. I'm not going to go deep into it because I don't want to freak your church out or anything, but we look at fundraising in three different ways. Today funds is our annual operating costs and where we are going with our annual operating costs. So we want to increase to about a $2.5 million a year budget to handle all the facilities and all of the work that we're doing with the expansion. And then the tomorrow funds are growth. These are the projects that, like the family infant house, purchasing that location, having that fully staffed, and finishing out the lower level. We started a $5.7 million campaign at the beginning of 2020, which was terrible timing to start raising capital, but God's been faithful. And so we're actually a year ahead of schedule on this fundraising and already operating several of these projects on a pilot basis. So we still need about, I think it's 1.2 million in capital in facilities costs that we have left. So we're over halfway there. And then our program expansion has actually done really well. I think we are, I would say we need about $600,000 more a year for that to be fully done. But we've been doing pretty good with our expansion. And then the Forever funds, this is a new area for us. And this is creating endowments, wills, trusts, charitable remainder trusts around Family Promise and the work that we do, so that eventually there's an endowment that the residual income pays for the annual operating costs, so that we can move away from a reliance on a single source of funding. Right now, we have a fairly big reliance on government funding. We're 42% government funded. I'd like to see that more about 20 in the future. And so our hope is to build some of these endowments and then also look at ways that we can grow into working with developers on housing of our own. Either that's where we partner with a new apartment complex, or we are owners in some way of different housing options. And so that's long-term what we would want to do. That's the biggest hang up right now, is actually just finding the housing. There's been less than a 2% vacancy rate for my entire time that I've been here in Spokane.
Oh.
Sorry, what?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I've been, and we are down under 1% right now, a vacancy rate. And so it's really hard to find housing, even when we've got families, 2-parent households, both of them working, just finding a place that will rent to them is difficult. And so we're doing a great job at that. That's why if you like us on Facebook, so that's one thing, like us on Facebook, because you get to see the success stories, and we're putting them out pretty frequently now. We moved 3 families out last week. But those success stories it's a big success to get somebody from homelessness into housing of their own, especially in this economy with the limited housing that's available right now. So here's the 3 things I'm going to ask of you guys. Okay. So I want you to pray these 3 things for us. 1, pray, Lord, what's your will with this? What's your will with family homelessness? 2, what's my part? And 3, God bless your people so they give generously of their time, talent, and treasure. What we are attempting to do with our churches is work to where we have monthly giving coming from our churches, monthly givers. We'd love to get 25 households at 200 plus a month, or a mixture of more households slower. We want to try to increase by $5,000 a month in monthly giving. And then we want each of our churches to give 1 week per quarter to focus on family homelessness and serving in our community. So that's what we are looking for, moving forward with, and trying to continue. So these are the ways 2 ways to get involved now, and then as we are opening different service opportunities, continuing to engage with us on that.
You know, Joe, something that well, we all heard about the, what's it called, the convention center downtown, when it was sheltering the homeless and $90,000 or whatever of damage. And as a coordinator, I realized we haven't heard anything about any damage in any of the shelters that you have. I mean, other than the normal incidental stuff. So I think that might be reassuring to people to know that that's not the norm, or maybe it's the norm for those types of temporary no barrier shelters. And
Yeah, so I'll address that. That's actually, of those 400 people that stayed at the convention center, there were no families, 0. The reason for that, even though families represent 35% of our homeless population, the reason for that is because we've been planning ahead. And so we've been doing a really good job at getting our families into permanent housing out of our shelters, which there's 2 ways that you increase capacity for emergency shelters. One is you build bigger shelters, and 2 is you get more people into housing. And so that opens up more bed space. We've been doing both of those things over the past several years. And so we moved more people into permanent housing than anybody else. And we've been increasing our capacity in a very focused and intentional way, so that when we got to this winter, we had some things in place that we could expand and not have to have families on the street. And then, yes, our families are just, they're different than what you see with typical downtown homeless. And so the damage is different. It tends to be, the ball being kicked over the fence type of damage, and not the what some of the stuff that they saw downtown was. But we do have a lot of people and a lot of odds and ends. We had a window break a couple years ago that was an autistic kid. That happens. I have an autistic son myself, so when I showed up to sit down with this child, it was very clear. It was like, oh, I feel like I'm talking to my own son. And so we got to sit together and just not say anything and stare at the window for 20 minutes until we had a conversation about children's books. And then we discovered that we needed to handle our anger differently. But for the most part, our families don't cause damage. We also don't get complaints. So in 2 years, we've had 1 complaint from 1 neighbor at the emergency shelter. And that neighbor, how do I put it? That neighbor does not like our families of color. That's basically the way I could put that. So anyhow, but for the most part, we've done a really good job at trying to engage. And in the smaller site locations, the neighbors don't even realize that they're living next to a shelter. So the Hartson location has brand new condominium developments built all the way around it now. And those folks didn't even realize that they'd been living next to a homeless shelter. And it's because they just don't, the most they see is a mom pushing a baby in a stroller to the bus stop. And so it's not a scary type of environment for sure. Questions?
Joe, we're going to have to stop, but man, this has been terrific. Just a wonderful way for you to share what's going on and what's happening. And so what I'm going to do is to say we're going to close the meeting, but not close the Zoom. So if you want to stay around and ask Joe some questions, and of course that's dependent on your time, but we're delighted that you were able to come. And we'd like to have you come back and talk about poverty at some point too.
Absolutely. Can I pray for you all before we close here?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for loving us, God. I thank you for sending your son to die on a cross, Lord, for us, reconciling us back to a right relationship with you, and then giving us this ministry to go and make disciples and to reconcile what's broken in this world back to a right relationship, Lord. And so, God, I pray, I thank you for the families at Covenant. I thank you for the way that they have engaged and continue to engage with our homeless families, our families that are in need in their community as a whole, Lord. God, I pray your blessings over them, over their families, over their households. And I pray that we continue to deepen this relationship so that we might one day end homelessness for families in Spokane County, Lord. And that we continue to work towards that goal, God. I thank you for them and for their heart to serve, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thank you, Joe. Thank you. All right. Well, if you all want to stay on, I'll be happy to stay on for a few minutes with any questions that anybody has.
Joe, we haven't forgotten about you at New Hope. We're still working our way there.
Great.
I'll have to give you an update.
All right. Yes. Yeah. That was the first snow. We've had a lot of snow since we've last met there, Sherry. So that'll be great.
How many people full-time do you have on staff?
I have, well, full-time, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. We have 49 staff members currently. I believe we have about 28 full-time equivalent FTEs currently right now.
Do you have trained counselors on staff? I assume you do.
We have case managers. They're not all trained counselors. And that is an area, if you have counseling background, we'd love to chat with you. The past 2 years have been significantly difficult for everybody, but let alone our families that are also dealing with homelessness during COVID, and our staff. We're an essential service, so we never shut down. We didn't even decrease capacity. We just opened more locations to do social distancing. And so we're tired. And it's hasn't gotten any easier. Like, it hasn't let up. It continues to go, and we're starting to see the evictions now. And that's really the big concern for February, March, and April. Is this is going to be the first wave of real evictions after the moratorium expired. And so we don't know what we're going to look like in April and May with what's coming. So we did everything we could to try to prevent as many evictions as possible with the rental assistance, but it's coming, and we're just, there's a big unknown there. So you can pray for us, but if you have a counseling background, and want to come and just chat with either my staff or some guests, we'd be happy to have that conversation.
So is the rental assistance going away?
It's done, yes. So all that money's been not fully spent yet, but it's been, it's the number of applicants matches the amount of money that is remaining. So we have about $600,000 that is remaining, and that has been used up with applicants. And then the other provider in Spokane city limits is Live Stories. They have about $13 million left, and I think they have applications for almost that much money in their pipeline currently. So both of us closed our rental assistance portals down on Friday at noon.
Joe, maybe a short story on how you all handled the COVID epidemic there at the emergency center, and then maybe a happy story of how Christmas was celebrated.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we were the first agency to enact COVID measures in Spokane County. So actually March 13th of 2020, we announced that we would stop the rotational shelter program because a lot of our churches are aging, and we didn't want to expose the that population. And there was a lot of unknown at that time. If you guys remember, nobody knew what was coming. We just knew something was coming. And so we paused the church rotation. And this is before the county or the city had done anything. And so we asked our partners for RVs so that we could have isolation facilities. We created our own isolation facility on site. We had RVs parked in the parking lot. So when people got sick, they were using the RVs as isolation. And then we did a lot of different things. We converted Hartson into a second shelter location at that point in time. And then so that we could social distance from the main shelter. And it's been pretty interesting, pretty challenging. We now are running a funded COVID isolation site for families that are homeless. That's for anybody in the county. So that's a newer thing. We'll have that contract for the next year. So we've done a lot with that. The other thing is we've had 2 outbreaks in the shelter. We had one November of 2020 where we had 42 positive cases all at the same time.
Wow.
And we had to quarantine the entire emergency shelter and the staff together for 2 weeks. So could you imagine 70 people all together in the same place for 2 weeks with little kids? And then when the schools went remote, there was nowhere for our kids to be. So we actually did school for 21 kids all at the same time in the meeting room in the emergency shelter for a period of, I think, 4 months. So we had all the computers set up. We worked with Comcast to get the internet fast enough to accommodate 21 computers all being on Zoom at the same time. And we did that. So it's been a challenge for sure with that. We're thankful that school's back. We hope it doesn't close down more, because every time we're just going to close for a day, that changes things dramatically inside the shelter for those days. So what was your second part of that? Oh, Christmas. Christmas is always the most challenging and the most rewarding time of the year in the emergency shelter, because nobody wants to be in a shelter on holidays. So Thanksgiving and Christmas are always very difficult for the parents. So we try to make it as great of an environment as possible. And so we have a day where all the donations that come in for Christmas gifts, where the parents go shopping and pick out gifts for their kids, but also where the kids go shopping for the parents, which actually has turned out to be probably the most rewarding thing, so that the kids could actually give their parents gifts at Christmas. And the kids get way more excited about giving their parents gifts than getting gifts on their own. It's a pretty amazing thing. And then my church, I go to the Rock Church. That's the church plant that we helped get going here. It's in the valley. We cook Christmas breakfast. And so unfortunately this year we couldn't do it on site. So we had to cook off site and then have it delivered. But the families did a big Christmas thing. Santa came, and then I dressed as Buddy the Elf and kind of danced around a little bit. You may have seen a commercial with me in it for rental assistance as Buddy the Elf. But yeah, we do a lot of stuff to try to make the environment as best we can for these families and kids.
Joe, do you partner with other agencies in Spokane much, or is that in terms of housing and that type of thing?
We do. We have, I think, over 100 partners when our churches are included into that mix. We try to partner with everybody we can to accomplish the mission. None of us can do this by ourselves or on our own. And so we probably have, we have some really deep partnerships with several organizations, including the Housing Authority. And so we actually created a pilot that had never been done before in the country, where the Housing Authority actually assigns vouchers to us as an agency, Section 8 housing vouchers. And then we do all of the case management and paperwork for those families that qualify to get that voucher assistance. Basically, we take on all of the responsibility of the housing authority for those. But that has worked really, really well. It started as a pilot in 2017. And in 2018, they called us and they said, hey, when we do our vouchers, our staff is getting about 30% of their families into housing. And of that 30%, about half of those, lose their housing within the first 2 years. You guys are at 100% on both of those things, on getting families into housing and in the housing retention. How are you doing that? And it was pretty simple. It was, we have 24 hours a day with people, and you guys have a 45-minute appointment every month and a half or so. So we just have a lot more relational time with folks and know who's going to do well and who's not. And they trust us because we just have more time with them. So that's probably one of our deepest relationships. So now we're up to basically as many families as we have that qualify for vouchers, we can help get that assistance for them.
Is that ongoing for several months or years?
It is, yeah. Yeah, and it varies depending on the family, and then also their income changes. I mean, if we're doing our jobs right, their incomes continue to change, which changes what their voucher is. So we help them, refile paperwork and adjust their vouchers towards that assistance, or reverse, where they have some type of, we have a grandfather that's caring for his grandchildren that his physical health is declining, so his ability to bring in income is decreasing. And so we've been able to work to help balance them out the other direction on that as well.
Do you see the messages on the screen? Because somebody asked what the requirements are for volunteering.
Oh, great question. So we have an application on our website, and I will post the website in the chat. Family Promise of Spokane.org. There's an application on there. We do a background check particularly for sex offenders. We don't allow sex offenders to participate in any of our programs, but otherwise the volunteer background check is pretty minor, checking for other things, and then we really want to partner in such a way that you are serving in a way that one uses your talents and skills in an effective way. And then also, for instance, if you have a background in accounting and you want to use that to serve, we've got some areas that could use that help significantly, in different areas. Or if you have a background in counseling, that's another one. We want to try to put people where their skills and talents could be used the best moving forward, rather than kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. But there are also a lot of different opportunities. There will be a lot more. Yep. All right. Well, thank you all so much for letting me chat with you today, also for staying on extra time with me. And really for several of you, I recognize several faces here that have served with us and served our families for a long time. I want to thank you for that and for your consistency with that. We have grown significantly in the size, but also in the number of people we serve, but in impact. And I think once we get through this last bit of COVID and eviction moratorium fallout, I think we will be in the strongest position we have ever been in to actually reduce the number of people that are coming into homelessness and shorten the length of time that they stay in that homeless environment significantly. And so we are keeping up pace right now, which is pretty much a miracle because all the other shelters are full, but they didn't expand by 50% like we did this year. So we expanded in preparation for what was coming. So we want to just thank you guys for sticking with us as a church, and really want to see what ways we can deepen that involvement moving forward rather than moving away from it. So I know the closing of the rotational shelter, a lot of churches were like, does that mean, we're not partnered together anymore? And what I would say is, no, that's false. That's the opposite. We actually need our churches and need church members to engage more. And it's going to be a greater ways that we can do that in the future. So thank you so much for that. My son's running down the stairs right now to get me. So, all right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.